It's Monday night, and you know what that means. Jersey First brings to you the latest edition of Real Talk, and I am New Jersey's premier award winning journalist, top 100 Latino via the Latino Spirit online magazine for 2020, 2021, and now in 2022. And your favorite conservative. Yes, that's right, it's me, Fernando Uribe. Hoping you all had a wonderful weekend. Happy April to you all. And certainly, I hope it was a great start to the month. I know on Friday, I hope everyone had a wonderful April Fool. And let's be honest, folks, every day is April Fool when we know we have a Sleepy Joe in the White House, hopefully only until 2024. But every day is April Fool's, it seems, in this country, ladies and gentlemen. But also, I hope you got to enjoy WrestleMania weekend for all of my fellow pro wrestling fans. Well over 150,000 people jam-packed into Cowboy Stadium in Dallas. So a shout out to my Dallas Cowboys there, and the best stadium in all of North America, Cowboy Stadium, for a record turnout for the 2 nights of WrestleMania. Let me a little tea here. Good stuff always. And again, for us pro wrestling fans, WrestleMania 38. Yes, folks, I feel really old right now, as WrestleMania 38 was indeed a success. We got to relive a little bit of our childhood and adolescence with the return of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and certainly the biggest main event in the history of WrestleMania took place last night. But again, ladies and gentlemen, it's one of those things where you get to really spring-like weather, hopefully. April showers, hopefully bring May flowers, and warmer weather, let's hope, is around the corner. And certainly, listen, while we take a break sometimes on this show from talking politics, you know what? I never take a break from bringing you the exclusives that nobody else in New Jersey media brings you on a consistent basis. And let me just say this, folks, because, one of the things that I enjoy doing about this show is the fact I get to talk to elected officials, both on the right and the left. I get to talk to activists, advocates, candidates. But every so often, I like to mix it up here and get fellow journalists on the program. And so I've been able to do that in recent months. Some good friends of mine that have decided to come on the show and have a conversation about really what's important, ladies and gentlemen, in the field of journalism. And again, this week, it's my pleasure to bring to you. He is from the Trentonian. Again, you can check out all the great journalism brought to you by the Trentonian at www.thetrenTonian.com. He's my good friend and fellow journalist, Isaac Avilucea, here as he joins us on Real Talk via Jersey First. Isaac, how are you, sir?
I'm well, Fernando. Hey, I appreciate you calling it an exclusive, my man. I've never been referred to as an exclusive.
Well, listen, one of the things, man, I take pride on this show, and again, I'm sort of a very different brand of journalism. Obviously, and we'll get to yours in a minute, but I'm opinion journalism at its max. And one of the things I really take pride in is engaging others in conversation. I mean, I always agree with my guests. Again, and I've had candidates, elected officials, activists, and and advocates alike, and even other journalists as well. But it's about having conversations, and it's about bringing people on here, let's be honest, that are on the rise in their specific professions. And I've been reading, your columns, bro. You're an exceptional writer, and certainly you're more of a roll up your sleeves, meat and potatoes, bread and butter type journalists. And I think those are the types that we sort of grow up looking up to, because they're the ones on the street. They're the one getting the scoops. They're the one getting the exclusives, right? Is that fair to say?
You know what, Fernando? It's kind of interesting that you describe me like that, because I think back in the day, in my college days, I wouldn't have described myself as such. And I actually really appreciate that moniker, but because to me, that means that I'm being fair and impartial. And really, the way I look at journalism has kind of evolved over the years. In college, I would say that I was more of a little bit on the opinion making side, and I think you can still see that sometimes in my brand of reporting. But I think that over the years, I have become a little bit more meat and potatoes, a little bit more just the facts, man, as the old school kind of journalists would say. And I think that in a really hyper-partisan climate like we live in, that type of journalism is really important, because what you see now is really this infiltration of the cable news wars that has kind of rebranded journalism. And so I'm kind of get back to basics, just the facts, man. But I wasn't like that in college. I think that I had a different view in college, because you want to wild out a little bit. You want to make a name for yourself. You want to do different things to get yourself a little bit of notice. You're feeding too much of the ego when you're trying to break into the industry a little bit, because you want to separate yourself from other college students that you're going to be vying for jobs with. So I remember really being the sports editor in my student newspaper, the Daily Lobo, and I actually got in an argument pretty quickly with the individual that had promoted me. He became a good friend of mine, Stephen Fernandez. He was my sports editor initially at the Daily Lobo, and when I came on, I immediately, as sports editor, want to start writing opinion columns about the things that we were covering from time to time. And he was like adamantly opposed to that. I think I remember being really immature back then and getting into a conversation with him where I was like, bro, if you don't let me write columns about sports, then I'm going to quit before my sports editor tenure even starts. And it was an immature thing at the time, but he actually ended up caving. And then we actually married in the middle, where he saw my value in writing opinion pieces from time to time about sports. And I saw his value of, hey, man, just the facts, right? And so I think that I look to have a balanced perspective now more than anything. And I think that comes through in what I do for the Trentonian, because we're a tabloid. So, yeah, you're going to have the little zingers and the little flair and the little personality. You see my personality come out in the stories I write, but I try to be fair and balanced, because to me, the objective of journalism isn't to be objective. The objective is to be fair and balanced, right? Because really you can get into a whole philosophical thought about what objectivity means, but really the objective is to be fair and balanced.
Well, listen, that's a great outlook, Isaac, to sort of view journalism in that lens. Before we get to some of your great work, before getting to college, was there an epiphany? Was there a moment where you said, hey, this is what I want to do? I love writing. I love giving opinions. I know you mentioned you transitioning into giving opinions, but was there a moment in time? Was there someone you looked up to, a journalist, a broadcaster, somebody that said, you know what, I want to do that. I want to get involved in journalism and do what he or she does, and this is my source of inspiration. Was there an epiphany at a time, or someone that really maybe helped you get your start or just motivated you?
You know what, that formative experience, it kind of, if you roll it all the way back, it goes to high school, right? I was looking for scholarship money, and I was entering and I ended up entering this essay contest. It was a national essay contest with a publishing company out of Seattle, out of Washington. The name of the company was Elder and Lamore, and they ended up publishing like 3% of these submissions that were nationwide. And I didn't win the scholarship money, but I ended up being among one of the 3% of the submissions that they published in a book called Authors of Tomorrow. So that was kind of like, hey, that was my first official clip, so to speak. And I kind of got the bug after that. And I had teachers leading up to that always told me, hey, Isaac, you got a knack for writing. But I remember actually I believe he was my 11th grade honors English teacher, 10th or 11th grade, Mr. Ragas. He's telling me, hey, Isaac, you have a flair for writing, you have a knack for writing. But I remember I ended up getting a B in his class, and I didn't understand it at the time, right? And now I do, because you don't give an A to the writer, because if you give an A to the writer thinks they've arrived, right? And you give a B to the writer because you want that writer to continue to pull more and more out of him or herself, or themselves, whatever your pronoun is. But I look at all these. I don't want to leave anyone out, because everyone was a inspiration in their own way. From Mr. Ragas to, there was another great journalist in New Mexico that I kind of looked up to. He got his start at the Daily Lobo. His name is Jeff Proctor. He's been very instrumental in Albuquerque, in New Mexico. Still now is writing a lot about police accountability, transparency, brutality, and I liked his go-gettedness. Right, he got to the point. He was in your face. He wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers. He was a dogged individual, and he didn't give. He didn't care who he offended, on the right, on the left, independent, and that's what I really strive to do. Right, journalism is not partisan. It should not be partisan. Journalism is about holding people accountable on the left, on the right, and in the middle.
Absolutely. And again, and Isaac, and folks, if you're just joining us right now here live at 6:10 on the East Coast, here on Jersey First via YouTube and also on Facebook Live on StreamYard, my guest this week is from the Trentonian, Isaac Avilucea here joins us on Real Talk. Isaac, let's get into sort of journalism per se. As you mentioned, again, the the importance of not being partisan. I mean, again, I think one of the things that really stands out about you and reading your work is that you do that. I mean, you engage in that objectivity, as you mentioned, and just reporting, right? As Joe Friday on the famous Dragnet, he would say, just the facts, man. And I know that you take special pride in doing that in the way, and it comes out in your writing, it comes out in your reporting. So I applaud that. Now, again, on the flip side, I mean, I'm someone who considers himself a journalist. Not everybody in New Jersey media agrees, but I'm a journalist. Now, again, my brand is opinion journalism, where I'm not going to, I'm quite the unapologetic conservative. However, I'm someone that can sit down and talk policy and try to be as objective as possible and say, listen, let's talk about facts, not feelings. Let's get emotional. Let's talk factual. And I think that's one of the things I take pride in. Not everybody agrees, especially people on the left in New Jersey don't like my brand of journalism. That's fine. It's not for everybody. But the bottom line is that journalism has evolved from the meat and potatoes, roll up your sleeves brand that I think we've all grown up, right? Whether it be someone like Michael Aaron, who gave so much, in his years in New Jersey with NJTV and obviously being on the street as well, doing writing, and others. Listen, the internet, social media has really helped journalism grow and expand into where, 20, 30 years ago, you might say, well, whatever Fernando Uribe is doing, that's not feasible. That's not for journalism. Well, let's be honest. It is. Because I'm not the only guy doing this. I'm not the only guy having opinion shows, but also trying to examine the journalistic landscape. And I think that it's become a very broad umbrella, Isaac, I think, to say the least. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is, Fernando. And I think really we're not that much different, to be honest with you, because you can have a purist ideology on journalism and say, oh, it's just the facts. But there is room in journalism under the umbrella of journalism for you and I. And you can't separate that as much as people want to. People want to be in just thought camps, right? I'm comfortable in the left thought camp. I'm comfortable in the right thought camp. And I'm not comfortable in any camp. I'm unencamped. And I think that's what journalism is. It's telling the objective of journalism is to tell the truth. And really, like, as long as when you really think about it, if you want to break down the purest perspective, every time that I write something, there are so many subjective axioms that go into a story. You determine as the journalist what facts make the cut, what facts do not make the cut, what lead to open up with, what lead not to open up with, how to situate your story and how not to situate your story. And all those are subjective. So you can have a philosophical discussion about whether there is actually purism and objectivity within the realm of journalism, or if it's just actually another form of opinion making told a little bit differently that conforms to a certain set of rules and standards, right? You're always approaching truth, but you can't ever get to absolute truth. And really, like, as long as you're intellectually honest about what you're doing, and I even almost kind of look at it like a lawyerly. I don't ever want to make an argument that is not fact-based, because to me, that's rhetoric. A strong argument is an argument that is based on fact and that is intellectually honest. And if it's based on fact and it's intellectually honest, it doesn't matter if it's opinion-making journalism or it's meat and potatoes journalism. It's journalism nonetheless.
Well said, Isaac. Well said. I have to ask here because I know that it always becomes sort of a hot topic for Jersey residents. When you go to the Trentonian, obviously, folks, and you check out, obviously, the www.trentonian.com, there's a tab there that talks about South Jersey. So it would lead me to believe, Isaac, that it's either North or South Jersey, or is there Central Jersey? Let's settle the debate right now.
Well, I mean, to the point about fair and balanced, right? If it can't just be polar opposites, there has to be a Central Jersey, because there has to be a middle ground between North and South Jersey. So that's what my answer is. There is a Central Jersey, and you can make the argument one way or another whether you think Trenton falls into it, but I think it does.
All right, fair enough. Let's get into your good work at the Trentonian. A great piece today. And folks, if you have had a chance to check it out, obviously, a good article here titled "Council Pres Demands Trent Police Director Resign Over the Shooting of an Unarmed Black Man." Now, again, a great piece by you late last week. The man known as, quote, Officer Friendly faces not so friendly fire from political foes who demanded his resignation Thursday during a rally over a police shooting that paralyzed an unarmed black man. Now, Jajuan Henderson, 29, out of Burlington County, filed suit in March, claiming he was victimized by 4 Trenton police officers who stopped him without probable cause during early February. Police warned body camera footage shows the harrowing encounter, which ends with Officer Michael Gettier opening fire 4 times on Henderson moments after he attempted to drive off in a parallel parked Saturn Ion during an encounter around midnight on Center Street. Henderson is heard in footage questioning why officers approached his vehicle, saying they did not have reason to stop him. Attorneys for Henderson, who was left paralyzed from the chest down, claim in a sharply different account in the lawsuit that their client went to the vehicle belonging to the mother of his child to retrieve a bottle of iced tea. Isaac, listen, when I read this, a lot of things just come to mind because especially in this very hyper polarized climate, when it comes to the police and the public, sometimes you wonder, hey, the police just stop you. Just don't resist. Don't be a problem. Just be compliant. And the police stop tends to go a lot smoother. I know that's easy for me to say because I'm not someone, I'm not a man of color. And sometimes, in Trenton or in other really urban areas of New Jersey, hey, that's not always, they don't have that luxury. But it seems like this case is really evolving. Obviously, we had Larry Hamm, the founder of the People's Organization for Progress, spoke at a rally in Trenton, protesting police brutality about it. Obviously, other activists have weighed in on this issue. Let's separate fact from fiction here, man. What's true and what's not true in this really unfortunate case?
I mean, I think the facts right now is there's a man that's paralyzed who was shot by a Trenton police officer, right? He's paralyzed from the waist down. And there are sharply different accounts. And that's what the litigation is for. The litigation is going to separate fact from fiction. And really in civil litigation, what you're talking about is a preponderance of evidence. So it's a 51%, 49% burden. Like the plaintiff only has to show that their account is a little bit more true than not in order to win a verdict, right? And that's the problem therein with getting to the facts of the matter, right? Luckily, we have all these different instruments to try to get closer to the truth. But you look at those sharply different accounts and you have to implicitly kind of understand that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? And there obviously, from the body cam footage has been released, there was some inconsistencies with Mr. Henderson's story. I believe in the lawsuit he had talked about, his lawyers had talked about when they held this joint press conference with the ACLU, that the officers appeared in plain clothes and were masked. And if you look at some of the body cam footage, those officers are actually in tactical gear with police logos clearly emblazoned across their chests. They're not masked, if I remember correctly, or maybe some of them are, but you see them interact with them and they have flashlights on his Saturn Ion. And I think that, I don't want to speak for him too much, but my view of that is that you're looking through a window, and I think that I would be able to see clearly that that is not true, right? But that does not negate the fact that the officers do not appear at this juncture in what I've read in the probable cause affidavit and some of the body cam footage. They don't seem to really have clear and articulable suspicion to stop him in the first place. And really, that's where the jumping point off is. Because why are you, if you don't have probable cause to stop an individual, why are you harassing him? And look what it escalated into. And I can see both points of view. I can understand what you're saying, Fernando, that, okay, compliance, and then it doesn't escalate. But I can also see that the officers are talking to him. At first, they're kind of calm, but at one point, the officer says that he's going to shatter the guy's window, and they tell the guy, stop reaching in the effing back seat. And if you come from a community that is, in your view, harassed, ostracized, on some level terrorized by the police, you have that intergenerational trauma when you go into an encounter with an officer. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, Fernando. I look white. I'm actually Latino, but not to the same extent that Mr. Henderson experienced. But I've had encounters with officers where they were just point blank excuse my French, assholes,
Yeah.
because they stereotype, and they tend to stereotype young males. And if you happen to be a minority, you have it even worse, right? And I think that's fair.
Listen, all very good points here, and I really appreciate you bringing this down for me. One of the things, Isaac, listen, I think this incident reminds us all about how difficult it is to be not just a police officer today, right? Considering the climate we've been living in for many, many years now. But, and again, and I don't mean this in any sort of derogatory way, but I say this often about deep urban areas, like sort of like the blue cities in New Jersey or even across the country, whether it's Trenton, Newark, Patterson, Passaic, Camden, New Brunswick. I mean, these are really urban towns. These are areas that are still, exhibiting high levels of poverty. And at the same token, we have police departments that, have a tough job in policing at times very dangerous areas in these cities. And it seems like Trenton's no exception. I remember driving to Trenton in recent years. I'll be honest with you, man. I'll give you a lot of credit. You're out on the street doing journalism, reporting. I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to be in Trenton past dusk. Okay. I don't mean this in any mean way to anybody, but Trenton looks, man, I don't know, dude. I give you a lot of credit. Parts of Trenton that look very shady. You can say about any part in New Jersey or any part of the country itself. Does that also lend itself to the narrative that Trenton's just, we're seeing some economic development, some gentrification, maybe some overall advancement in Trenton, but is it still sort of one of the rougher cities to be in New Jersey? Is that perception still real?
It's hard to answer this question, Fernando, because the inclination is to be a prisoner of the moment, to look at the immediate past, right? And look at 2020 and 2021 when Trenton had historic levels of violence, gunplay. You had back-to-back years of 40 homicides apiece. They eclipsed their previous record of 37, which was set amid the gang wars in 2013. And if you look at it historically, like those times were when there were delineated gangs. There was the Crips, the Bloods, and the Latin Kings, and a lot of these different very entrenched, what I would call hierarchical gangs, right, that have structure. And now you see these very decentralized kind of sects, and they're more like neighborhood factions, and there's not a lot of leadership per se within these groups. There is a structure, but what you really have is kind of like this Lord of the Flies type of dynamic where it's every man.
Good reference.
What's that?
No, that's a great reference. Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, it's like Lord of the Flies, right? Like it's every man or woman for himself, and everyone's out to prove that they're the biggest dog in that neighborhood. And when you have that and you don't have leadership, right? There were times where you saw back then the Crips and the Bloods would have a ceasefire. They'd come together and the leadership would speak for the gang. And now in this dynamic, the one that speaks the loudest is the one with the biggest gun and the one that is making the biggest bang. And that's why I think you see some of this record bloodshed, because it's really no different than what you and I do in different fields. We're all out to prove ourselves in a meritocracy, that we're the best and the brightest in each industry. And if you actually look at that from a professional standpoint, right, which is going to offend some people, how can you look at murder and drug trafficking and gangsterism as a profession? Well, it is, right? It's entrenched in this society. And if it is a profession, the goal is in a capitalistic society to be the best at whatever you do. And if you don't have a lot of opportunities in a blighted, downtrodden, historically panged city, what do? You do what you got to do.
No, all fair points there. All fair points. Isaac, is there a policing problem in Trenton from what you're reporting and let's say people who you talk to on the ground in the community? Is there still a very huge line of division between the community and the police? Because again, we know going back to the summer of 2020, we know it became sort of a focal point of a sort of a national and even international movement, right? When it came to the, highlighting Black Lives Matter as a movement, even though it's not new. It had been around since 2013 after the death of Trayvon Martin. But or whatever you want to call them, were relatively, let's say, peaceful in New Jersey. That wasn't the case in Trenton. There was one correct hand like he did in other cities, Philadelphia, New York City, St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, wherever, other very urban centers of the country. But it seems like there's still an immense mistrust between the community and the institution of policing. Is that a fair assessment right now in 2022?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a mistrust of police, because if you reel it back from a certain perspective, the police are inherently distrust because of what they signified going back to the days of slavery, right? They were used as an institution to catch and return slaves to the plantations, right? So inherently, when you have an institution like slavery as a foundation for the creation of an enforcement arm, there's always going to be a mistrust between the enforcement arm and certain communities, especially communities of color. I don't think that's going away. I think that the hope is that it gets better little by little, generation after generation. And I think that we see that. And as much as I think that we see a lot of friction between the police and Americans, we see a lot of understanding, right? You see a lot of officers that came and participated in a lot of Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations. They kneeled and walked with people. And I think that sometimes we get so entrenched in our thought patterns that we don't want to see each other's humanity. And I've been guilty of that myself. There's been times where, in writing different stories about police brutality, about lack of police accountability, about lack of transparency, I stopped thinking about officers sometimes as human beings. But then I'm quickly reminded, because I have to interact with so many different types of individuals in every community. And you have police officers, you have regular people, you have politicians, you have every facet of society. Every society is a microcosm of and a larger reflection of the world. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have every type of individual in that society that's reflected in the world, right? And so that brings me back to my humanity, that when I think that we're so disconnected from each other, we're actually really not. And as long as we strive to see each other's humanity, we can point out the flaws in humanity in a very human way. And that's what I really strive to do as a journalist now. I think that I used to write with a lot more anger when I was in college. My pen was very angry. And now I strive to try to understand and properly contextualize certain situations for people so that they can, maybe they don't accept what happened, but they can understand it a little bit better. And if they can understand it better, then we get closer toward acceptance.
Fair enough. All fair points. And folks, if you're just joining us right now at 6:28 here on the East Coast and live on Jersey First on the latest edition of Real Talk is my good friend and fellow journalist from the Trentonian, Isaac Avilucea, here tonight on the program. Isaac, staying on that topic real quick, and we'll move on to a little bit more in Trenton in a moment. But, you mentioned about looking at things through sort of a human lens, and we know that 2 years later, after, let's be honest, the institution of policing has really been dissected quite considerably, right? In not just international lenses, but national, statewide as well. When we look at someone like Larry Hamm going to speak at a rally or at an event to denounce police brutality, again, everyone's entitled to do whatever they want. But, one of the things that I think makes this conversation difficult, right, was, let's be honest, during that summer of 2020, whether it was BLM, the movement, or let's say it was activists like Larry Hamm or others, they were all about defund, defund, defund. Listen, I'm also an educator by day. Words matter. And I think the way we conceptualize things also matters as well. And I would just argue that, again, at the moment, a lot of people got emotional, journalists, activists, elected officials, advocates on all sides of the aisle from all ethnicities, backgrounds, colors. I think 2 years later, I would just argue that at the time it was an emotional sort of reaction to what happened in Minneapolis. And we saw it sort of marinating throughout the country, I think the wording matters where, listen, I used to work in the criminal justice system before entering academia. I could be intellectually honest and say, yes, are there elements about policing that could be improved upon? Absolutely. Are there elements about policing that can be fine-tuned? Yes, and modified. No question. But I think what we're seeing, though, is that this knee-jerk reaction that we've seen nationally, even statewide, to policing, I don't want to say backfired, Isaac, but when all we heard was defund, 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 we know that's not the solution. We know that we need policing to help preserve law and order, but we also need accountability. So I'm for that as well. We know Trenton, obviously, being the state capital, and what we know is one of the biggest topics is civilian complaint review boards. I'm not sure if you've really delved into that or if you've talked to a lot of people in Trenton about that, but it seems like that's going to be the next hot button topic in New Jersey, coming out of Trenton, coming out of whether it be in departments like the Trenton Police or others, where maybe the citizenry wants more accountability. They want more civilian complaint review boards. That's a hot topic right now in the legislature in Trenton. What are you hearing, people you talk to? Is this something that's realistic, or we're going to need a lot of different people to come together to make sure that this sort of idea can operate as smoothly as possible?
So that's a state question, right? That has to be enacted by lawmakers, because there was that Supreme Court case that came out late last year. Yeah. The Newark case that basically said, the Supreme Court ruled, until it's enacted by the legislature, you can't have civilian review boards with subpoena power. That has to be enacted by the legislature. So what you've seen is that really stymied cities like Trenton's efforts to bring and formulate a civilian review board, because it's going to be a paper tiger without the subpoena power. And if you can't have something with subpoena power and that has fangs, then you've already defanged it from the get-go. And really, what are you doing? It's just another de novo board that rubber stamps decisions that can't really delve into it. And let's say you have a case that really needs accountability and transparency and something to move and shake out of it. Well, if you don't have the tools to get to it, why even start? Right? There's an argument made for that. I don't necessarily agree with that. I believe in incremental progress, or I wouldn't do what I do. But even with what we do, there's limitations to it, right? Like, I don't have subpoena power. I have the Open Public Records Act, but there's 7 or 8 exceptions to the types of records that are even lawfully obtainable. So when you don't have all the instruments of power accessible to you, your hands are a little bit handcuffed. And until that changes at the statewide level, you're not going to see a lot of cities move toward setting up civilian review boards. But they're paramount. They're very instructive and a powerful instrument to get closer to accountability, because I firmly believe that the more eyes on something, the better off it is, because you're going to see that 360, and you're going to have so many different eyes with so many different perspectives and experiences on an institution that can give you the tenfold level of insight and recommendations that you're going to need to make something as best as it is, right? The way we become our best version of ourselves is by having a bunch of mirrors around us, and we use all of each other as mirrors to get to that point.
No, well said. I know up here in Hudson County, where I live, I know nearby in Jersey City, the county's largest city, has been talking about implementing a civilian complaint review board and the importance of that. Let me pick your brain for a minute about that. I can tell it's a topic that you're very passionate about and you're very knowledgeable about. And maybe this is where, and you'll have to forgive me, maybe this is where the academic in me and the snob comes out a little bit. I'm sort of the belief that when it comes to civilian complaint review boards, what I'd like to see on them are professionals in the field, whether it be attorneys, people that work in corrections, probation, like I did, people that work in the judiciary, different elements of the criminal justice system, maybe, academics as well. I'm always a little leery, man, because, again, it's an issue up here in Hudson County, for example, where there are some, very left-wing or progressive council people in Jersey City that want local activists on. And we, again, here in Hudson County, we know how those activists, where they lean. And it doesn't seem like that's going to be a very objective body. And that's what concerns me. I'm not trying to sort of just say, oh, only people with degrees and experience in the field should be allowed. I'm not saying that exactly, but I'm also very nervous and I cringe at times about allowing activists on those civilian complaint review boards, especially when you're, again, if the legislature does let this marinate organically and it gets to where it needs to get to, there's going to be subpoena power. I'm a little leery of subpoena power body, especially when it contains certain members of the board that, again, don't understand the system. They can be activists and civil rights leaders and all that stuff. That's great. I'm more concerned about having, again, CJ professionals, attorneys, retired judges, whatever. I'd rather roll the dice with those professionals on the board than letting like sort of full-blown activists on, because I'm not sure if I can trust them. Maybe that's my partisanship coming out. What are your thoughts?
I would actually counter that and say that everyone's an activist, just for different things, right? Well, I don't know exactly what, but your PhD is in what? Humanitarian or?
No, it's political science. Political science.
Political science. So would you say that you're an activist for politics or political science, right? I mean, look at what I do. I'm a journalist, and really what I am is, another word for it is, I'm an activist for the truth. So really, we're all activists. If you're in law enforcement, you advocate for law enforcement. And if you're a good advocate, then you have a balanced perspective and you can understand the people you're policing and the people you interact with, and you understand it on the other side of it. So really, like, what I want more than people with names and titles, although I agree with you, I want a balanced perspective. And the way you get balanced perspective is you have different disciplines. It has to be, to your point about academia, the best approach is interdisciplinary, right? Where you're taking all kinds of different perspectives and marrying them up. You have sociology, you have criminology, you have psychology, you have all these different disciplines, and you bring in more people to the table, not less. If you bring in more to the people, you have more nuanced perspectives. And while you might have extremes in viewpoints, the more extremes you have, it actually is like a rubber band and it stretches it, but you end up coming as a body to something that's more balanced and in the middle when you have extremity. That's like actually why our system continues to work, even though we're really hyper partisan now. It would collapse. It would turn into authoritarianism if one side won all the time. So the fact that we have this polar extreme pull actually shows the elasticity in our democracy. Does that make sense?
No, it certainly does. And again, fantastic breakdown for certain on that. Let me ask you this, Isaac. We're about to wrap up shortly, and I appreciate your time. I know you've had a very busy day. It seems like the lack of harmony that exists between the mayor in Trenton and the city council at times almost seems as dysfunctional as the Kardashians. There's been some very interesting tension between the mayor and members of the city council in recent years. Is that just being overblown, or is it just something that really seems to be a problem in, again, not just the executive branch in the city of Trenton, but also in the legislative branch in Trenton?
Fernando, the Kardashians are mad at you for comparing them to Trenton politics, my man. I'd argue that the Kardashians are more functional than the Trenton city government right now. You have a faction of council that is just completely obstinate to any proposal that is backed or even tangentially appearing to be backed by the mayor, Uribe-April. And what you have is the epitome of government gridlock and government breakdown. It's the dysfunction is almost systemic at this point, to where, for example, today I just wrote a story about another lawsuit that council has initiated to stop an executive order that the mayor issued last month to get certain contracts in place to keep Trenton government functioning when the clerk, Matthew Conlon, walked out of a meeting. They've had to cancel several meetings. And in essence, they haven't been able to approve resolutions and ordinances to continue operating city government. So from his perspective, he thinks we're in a bind. I have this executive authority to do this. I'm going to do this, or else we're going to end up where are we going to end up? And just because it's Reed Gashora, you have certain factions of council that will oppose it just on the principle that that's their adversary. And that is not somewhere you want to be in a democracy, where you're not looking at something rationally and soberly and based off facts and based off whether an initiative is good for the goose and the gander. You're just saying, I don't like that dude, so I'm going to oppose it. And that's
Well,
what is that?
Let me ask you this, because again, maybe our audience isn't really familiar with Trenton politics per se, but is this a partisan issue when it comes to party ideology? Is it about maybe a mayor that's too left, or is it a council that's too center or too right, or maybe it's all a bunch of Democrats that just can't seem to agree on anything? I mean, what's at the heart of it? What's really the source of the tension within city government? I know, again, it's sort of a municipal government. It's a blue city for the most part. It's a Democratic mayor. It seems like it's a Democratic city council. But is it sort of degrees of, well, it's this type of Democrat against this type of Democrat, or is it something else?
I think it's mistrust. I think it's mistrust of government officials, and I think there's a historical account for that, right? And I think that when you have a city that has experienced the deep intergenerational trauma that I'm talking about stuff like Tony Mack, right? The ex-mayor of Trenton, who went to federal prison for scandal mongering, for trying to bilk the city, for trying to use the city as a vehicle to enrich himself and his cohorts. And that leaves a trauma of mistrust in the city, not only in the residents, but in the policymakers. And so I think that they often view some of these initiatives as too good to be true. And if they're too good to be true, they're too good for somebody because somebody's trying to enrich themselves. And I think that you have another layer of Trenton being kind of the perceived as and on some level validly perceived as this like forgotten child in state government. You have 50% of the tax base in Trenton is untaxable. You got pilot, you got payment in lieu of taxes, because all the state government occupies Trenton. And yet the state aid has been depleted year after year under Governor Chris Christie. And then now you have Phil Murphy that brought back about 10 million in capital state aid. But I think it's fair to say that Trenton doesn't get its due sometimes. And I think that the state government should be funding Trenton on a greater level, not depleting it. And Trenton can't be the great capital that everybody wants it to be without help. And I feel like sometimes there are valid arguments that these policymakers make. They just get stuck up in the emotion of trauma. And we all do that. It's very easy to do that.
It's interesting you bring up that moniker. It reminds me about that bridge, right? Trenton makes, the world takes, right? Seems like Trenton makes and like state legislature takes. So it seems like that's what's going on. Let me pick your brain about this, because I'm someone that has made a point in New Jersey media to really go after what's wrong in New Jersey. I mean, obviously, I don't need a PhD in political science to know what's wrong with New Jersey. If you study New Jersey history for some time now, we know what's wrong. It's become unaffordable in many parts of the state. Where I live in Hudson County, I mean, I can just walk 2 blocks. I look at Manhattan. It's expensive here. Okay. Just like down by Camden, you live near Philly, it's expensive as well. And everything's sort of squished in the middle. You know, we have the highest property taxes in the country. Spending continues to be out of control in Trenton. And I'm someone that, gets a lot of flack on social media. Oh, Fernando, you're so harsh on the left. You're so harsh on Democrats in Trenton. Well, Isaac, I mean, newsflash to our audience at home. For 20 years, one party has ruled the legislature. Okay. One party, and maybe some elements have become a little more left, progressive, whatever you want to call it, but they've never met a tax they don't like. It seems like every year the budget balloons up, and whether it's under Phil Murphy, whether it's under Chris Christie, whether it's under Johnny Corzine, or anyone else. Hey, listen, I remember I interviewed Jim McGreevey a while ago. And I remember when he was governor in 2004, he submitted a budget at the time in 2004 for $21 billion. That was a lot of money at the time. And people said, wow, that's a big budget. In 2022, and let me just look at some numbers here. We're looking at about $49.4 billion, which is what's being proposed again for this upcoming fiscal year. Again, for our audience at home, the fiscal year in New Jersey ends on June 30th. So as required by state law and the state constitution, a budget has to be signed no later than 11:59 p.m. on June 30th. If it is not, then the state will shut down. We've seen that happen. We saw it happen under Chris Christie, I believe in 2017. We saw it under Governor Corzine in 2006, and probably some before that. The bottom line is we know what's wrong with New Jersey, and I'm the one that constantly keeps harping about it. The irresponsible spending. Again, what I would argue, the coddling of illegals in New Jersey, the way we sort of bend over backwards when it comes to spending or programs or whatever you want to call it. It just seems like there's this sort of very progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Isaac, again, which has ruled the legislature. It's not like Republicans or conservatives like me, fiscal conservatives like me are to blame. Those people don't have a voice. Pretty much Democrats have been able to rubber stamp things and shove them through the legislature for 2 decades now. Again, there's some Republican opposition, but at the end of the day, Democrats have the votes. It just seems like other journalists in New Jersey aren't willing to tackle these issues, and they sort of acquiesce to it. Again, I go after Uncle Dave, David Cruz with NJTV. I go after Tom Moran with the Star Ledger. I go after even Insider NJ. People like Max Pizarro, Jay Lasser, all these left-wing leaning journalists that would rather, crucify conservatives or not really focus on what's wrong in New Jersey, because it seems like they want to carry buckets of water for the left in the state. That's how I perceive it, Isaac. Am I wrong here?
I don't think you're necessarily wrong, but I would point out respectfully that there are just as many journalists that carry buckets for people on the right. You have an entire channel that's dedicated to carrying gallons and gallons upon gallons of buckets for Trump and Trump level republicanism on the right. It's called Fox News, right? And when you actually think about it, maybe that isn't really far off of the ideal that we're striving for, because if you have buckets of people carrying different levels of water for different sides, then the water's getting evenly distributed, and eventually you're going to come back to something in the middle, right? You're going to come back to that elasticity in our democracy, that once you get more extreme, the good thing about I see in a form of extremism and a form of political rancor that is as extreme as we're experiencing today, is that from extremism, you get extreme results, so to speak. Yeah. And sometimes they aren't good, but they're very, it's extreme change. And I think that's what you're seeing a lot. And I think that really the goal of journalism is to reel in those extremes. And that's why what you're talking about is problematic, because if you're carrying buckets of water for the right or the left, you're not bringing the buckets of water to the well of the worried in the middle. The residents that are like you and I that really want to know about the facts of an issue. And to use Governor Chris Christie as an example, that dude was lounging on the beach while government shutdown was going on. So as when you really think about America from a historical perspective, we've wanted to distance ourselves from the crown, but we've just actually found a different form of crowning a king. And right. And to your point about the budget, right? Journalism is about holding politicians responsible, regardless of political stripe, to the money that they spend on behalf of the taxpayers. And that's the trouble when you're carrying water for a certain party. But you saw still what happened at the end of the day when journalists be journalists and go to the efforts they should go to hold politicians accountable. You have a snapshot of a beached whale of a politician named Chris Christie lounging on a beach in New Jersey, enjoying the very excess that we're being deprived of the masses. And that's what journalism is about. Don't point out when the politicians are depriving and feeding off the excess that should be going properly to you and me and the people that really deserve it. Because that's what democracy is about. It's doing the best for the most, not doing the best for me.
Isaac, well said, man. Before I know that you mentioned during your college days, you were very much into sports, right? And you certainly wanted to write about sports. And again, not to sort of give away too much about you, I know you mentioned off the air to me, you live in Bucks County. But one thing we share in common, besides being exceptional journalists, right, in our own way, you and I are sort of long-suffering members of Cowboys Nation. So,
Yes,
what's
sir.
that like being a Cowboys fan when you live so close to Philadelphia? That must be quite the experience for you, brother.
You know what? I've been told don't wear a cow. I've never actually had the opportunity to go to an in person. I was going to go to an in person Cowboys Eagles game this last year. I didn't because the tickets they jack them up, right? That's a rivalry that is timeless. But I've been told, yo, don't go to a Philadelphia Eagles game with a Cowboy jersey on because you're going to get tuned up.
Well, Isaac, I'll make you laugh. Just a few months ago, actually, one of my good buddies has Eagle season tickets. So whenever the schedule comes out, he makes it a point to say, "Hey, come down. We'll go to the game together." And I went in January, that Saturday night game when it was like 18 degrees. I was there with my Cowboy hoodie. It took me 20 minutes to take one good picture by the field. And if you remember, that was a game we smoked the Eagles at. So I was ecstatic. It took 20 minutes just to get a good picture because every time I posed by the field, I was getting stuff thrown at me. I had a 10-year-old curse at me. I mean, think about it. A 10-year-old boy cursing and spewing vulgarities that you think you would hear, I don't know, at a strip bar, not from a 10-year-old, right? But that's the life of being a Cowboy fan, right, in New Jersey.
You know what? We're just very passionate about our sports because, like, I think that we look at it as a form of escapism, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to get too deep into it, but that's why I got out of sports writing a little bit because I don't think that we should treat sports like an escapism from reality because it's actually a reflection of reality. And reflected, you see the awful parts of society, right? Like to your point about you have a 10-year-old cursing you out at a game, and you're like, bro, it's just a game, right? But it's not. People take it more serious than it is, and there's good and bad parts of that, right? It's every version of society reflected in sports, and that's what makes the appeal of it. But that's also what makes it unappealing sometimes.
Hey, Isaac, I live 10 minutes from MetLife, so when I go to that Giants Cowboy game, it's a home game for the Cowboys basically lately. But it's I get my fair share of abuse, but nothing like Philadelphia, that's for sure. Isaac, real quick here, not to give out any spoilers. I know you publish stuff daily for the Trentonian. Folks, again, check out Isaac Avilucea at the Trentonian at www.trentonian.com. Any big stories you're working on? Again, not to give too much away, but anything big you're working on, maybe a little tidbits for our audience about any big exposés or any big stories that you're working on in the immediate future?
Hey, stay tuned, man. That's all I'll say. I like to keep those ones kind of close to the chest as a good journalist would do. And look, every day is a big story, right? Because the story of the day is about informing the readership, informing the voters and the delegates that actually delegate to the society who is in charge of who. That's what the story of the day is, right? Informing those people, informing people like you and us so we can make really good decisions for everything that we experience in life, from our policymakers on down. So I try not to look at it as this is the story of this is the story. Every story is the story.
Well, we'll leave it right there. Isaac, I want to thank you for your time. I know you've had a very busy day. I can't say enough about taking the time to come on the show here. And I'll definitely want to have you back on later on this spring. But do me a favor. Please tell everyone you know how much you're a fan of Real Talk via Jersey First TV. And I look forward to having you back on the show. I'll give you the last word, bro.
And no, I appreciate it, man. I think your show is aptly titled Real Talk. And I'm a hip hop fan. Real Talk, perfect title, bro.
Well, now that you mentioned that, real quick, favorite hip hop recording artist?
Lupe Fiasco. I just saw him a month ago in New York in Brooklyn Steel. So that guy means a lot to me.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have to talk some 90s hip hop. I'm a big fan of that. Off the air, we'll have to talk about maybe, who's on our Mount Rushmore of hip hop on another day. But ladies and gentlemen, he is Isaac Avilucea. Again, follow him on Twitter at Isaac Avilucea. And so hit him also on Facebook. He writes for the Trentonian, an exceptional journalist. Folks, you want to check out his stuff each and every day. Isaac, God bless you, bro. Let's go Cowboys.
Sounds good, man. Take care. Go Dak.
Have a good one.
Later.
All right, folks. Great episode here today. Once again, with Isaac Avilucea from the Trentonian. And, listen, these are the exclusives I take pride in bringing you, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the current media landscape in New Jersey, when it comes to just talking about what's transpiring in our political climate, dissecting the state of modern journalism. And it helps when you have great guests, once again, like Isaac Avilucea from the Trentonian on the show this week. Well, folks, again, I want to thank you so much for tuning in here and joining us again as we usher in the month of April. Certainly, I hope you all had a wonderful start to the month. Again, enjoy the NCAA final later on tonight on CBS. Again, it's always great to hear Jim Nantz commentate on anything, really. So tune into that later on tonight. For us pro wrestling fans, again, folks, we got to enjoy WrestleMania weekend from Dallas. Again, a shout out to that wonderful ballpark in Arlington, Texas, Cowboy Stadium. Let me get a little tea again. The best ballpark, if not in North America, but in the entire world, folks. Again, 150,000 people converged upon Arlington, Texas for the 30th edition of WrestleMania. It never gets old for us. So once again, folks, I want to thank you all for tuning in here. Don't forget to check out Jersey First on Facebook. Make sure you check out their website, www.jerseyfirst.org. That's Jersey, the number 1 ST.org. Make sure you also follow Jersey First on both Twitter and Instagram. Check out my own Instagram as well, at The Amazing Professor. Also check out this show on Instagram as well, at Real Talk with Fernando Uribe. And also make sure you check me out on Facebook as well. Folks, we got great guests lined up here for the month of April, well into May and to June as well. Coming up next Monday Night Live at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Somerset County Commissioner Sarah Sui will join us. She'll have a lot to say about what's going on in Somerset County politics and also in the Garden State political climate as well. Folks, I can't say enough again about all our great guests that make Real Talk with Fernando Uribe possible. And again, wouldn't it be possible without all of you, my loyal viewing audience who tune in every single week, not just only on Facebook Live via StreamYard, but also on the Jersey First YouTube page. So always remember, ladies and gentlemen, if it's unbiased, unfiltered, and unafraid, it's always Real Talk right here via Jersey First. I am New Jersey's premier award-winning journalist, Top 100 Latino via Latino Spirit Online magazine for 2020, 2021, and also now in 2022. And it's certainly your favorite conservative, Fernando Uribe, saying so long. And I'll see you next time here, folks, next Monday Night Live at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for the latest edition of Real Talk via Jersey First. Have a great week, everyone.